You're listening to The Pulse on AMI Audio. I'm Grant Hardy. On March 17th, 2021, Bill C-7 received royal assent, which broadened MAiD, medical assistant in dying, eligibility in Canada to include assisted suicide solely on the basis of disability. And Canadian disability advocates are really sounding the alarm, highlighting possible violations of rights enshrined in the UN Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Krista Carr is Chief Executive Officer of Inclusion Canada, which works to advance inclusion and human rights of people with intellectual disabilities in Canada. And she's joining us now to update us on the important advocacy taking place surrounding MAiD in Canada. Krista, thank you so much for joining us on The Pulse.
Thanks for having me.
Can you just start by introducing us, telling us a little bit more about Inclusion Canada and in what ways your member organizations support individuals with disabilities?
Yeah, so Inclusion Canada is a national organization with 13 provincial territorial associations and over 300 local associations across Canada. And we work on behalf of people who have an intellectual or developmental disability and their families on issues from birth to death. So we do all ages, all stages, and we work to really advance the human rights and full participation and inclusion in community of people with an intellectual disability and their families.
So, as you mentioned, a significant role of your organization is advocacy. Obviously, attitudinal barriers are really, really huge in Canada. Why do you think ableism is so prevalent in this country, and how can we advocate against it?
I think that's a really good question, and one, to be honest, that we struggle with every day. And it almost feels at times like it's getting worse instead of better, unfortunately. And I think that, this whole idea that the inherent unconscious bias that people carry about people with disabilities, what it's like to live life with a disability, all of those things, negative, that's often a negative impression. It's often nowhere close to reality. And the whole idea around ableism being, we like people, we have this version of people as being normal, and normal is good. And what our version of normal is this particular definition. And I think we often see people with disabilities as somehow other than and needing special places and special services and special situations. We often call it in Inclusion Canada, special places for special people. When that, of course, is not at all what we want. And we know that people with disabilities are very much a part of the human fabric of society, no different than anyone else. We know that the thing that disables people with disabilities is actually not their disability. It's all the barriers and things that occur in the environment around people that disables them, not at all their disability itself. And I think we have to stop doing things that further entrench ableism in our country, because, even the way we talk about people is often, disabling language. When we talk about caregiving, for example, well, in our organization, we try not to use that word, only because the idea that it conjures up is that the person that needs support, which is what we would call it, is somehow, weak or less than or a burden or needs, when really no. We all need different types of support in different ways. We're all very interdependent people, and we know that people with disabilities live really good lives when they have the support that they need to do that.
Yeah, it's amazing just to think of how reliant, quote unquote, able-bodied people are on so many different things, governmental services, supply lines, whatever it is, that you just would not be able to survive with if they were cut off. So literally everyone is interdependent on each other. And you look at the amount of people who will have a disability at some point in their lives. And it's just amazing that we still have this concept of like normal versus abnormal. But really appreciate the advocacy that you're doing in support of inclusion and accessibility. So let's dive into a couple of issues. The United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities took place in Geneva last week. What is it exactly, and how did you and Inclusion Canada participate?
So Canada signed and ratified the convention. And when it did that, as part of that process, there's some expectations on Canada as a country that has ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And there is a committee, a UN committee, that reviews the countries that have signed the agreement and looks at how they're doing at implementing the convention. Because if you signed it and you ratified it, that means you're committed to implementing it. And so it isn't just, oh, we signed this nice piece of paper and we go away and say we're such great people. We have to actually report. Canada as a government, federal government, has to report on how Canada's doing at implementing the convention. And as part of that process, civil society, which is basically disability organizations representing people with disabilities, organizations of people with disabilities, have a part to play in that. So what happened in Geneva last week was Canada's review. So in other words, prior to going to Geneva, Canada submits a report to the United Nations Committee talking about how well they're doing on implementing all the articles in the convention. And at the same time, civil society organizations of people with disabilities, are able to submit what they call a parallel report. So we say how we think Canada's doing, and we submit that to the United Nations as well. So it isn't just, they're not just hearing from Canada. And then last week in Geneva, as part of the review, a group of delegation of disability organizations went and presented to the committee. So we have a certain amount of time where we can present and tell the committee how we think Canada is doing, in addition to the report that we submit. The committee can then ask questions of the community to further dive into issues, to clarify, to ask other questions maybe we didn't address in our presentation. And we get to tell the committee how well or not well we think Canada is doing. And then the next day, Canada goes in front of the committee. And then the committee gets to ask, having read the government's report, having read the disability organization's report, gets to ask Canada questions about its performance. And then when that process is all done, and so there's a back and forth discussion, when that process is done, the committee writes what they call a concluding observations report, which we should get around the end of March. And the committee, that report will tell Canada where it needs to pull its socks up, for want of better terminology, in terms of implementing the convention. And so it would be the committee's way of saying, you need to do better in these areas, you're doing well in these areas, and you need to do more in these areas, etc.
Yeah, seems like there's often kind of a disparity between how the government maybe thinks it's doing versus how these advocacy organizations are telling our country that they're doing. But I'm just curious, do you find this is effective? Like, is it useful when we get that report? Is it acted upon?
Oh, that's a really big question, Grant. So
Okay.
I think that the report is useful for civil society organizations in terms of pushing government. It's got more tools at its disposal to kind of push government to do better. It isn't binding on Canada, so it's not like Canada gets it and it's like a court order and they have to go and do what it says. But I think, and I do think it does have some influence The last report on Canada, really focused in on a few different areas where Canada needed to improve. As a result, there was an effort by government to try to kind of work with Canada or with the disability organizations to figure out how they might do better in some of those areas. So, I mean, there's varying degrees, I think, of movement. The last review talked about Canada needing an action plan around implementation. I think that's where we got the Disability Inclusion Action Plan from that the government released. Not all we would want it to be for sure, but just I think it does have some effect. Does it have all the effect we'd want it to have? No.
Yeah. So let's dive in and talk about Track 2 MAiD, Bill C7, I believe it is. And can you give us a sense of like what exactly they're saying here, what it is, and who is covered by it?
So Track 2 MAiD came in after the initial MAiD legislation, and the initial MAiD legislation, the disability community really worked hard to keep the criteria for accessing medical assistance in dying in Canada to being a terminal illness. So if you're dying, suffering intolerably, your death is imminent, you get to control the timing, etc. When Bill C7 came in, and so we won the day on that one. That was a big fight that the disability community fought very hard to keep that as the criteria, and it applies equally to anybody. When they brought in Bill C7, it's a second track. We call it lovingly, not so lovingly, Track 2 MAiD. It's only for people with a disability, not at end of life, so not terminal death, not imminent, etc., who are experiencing suffering which is considered intolerable to them, is the language. And they, and only they, back to our special tracks for special people, have a quick pathway to the lethal injection. And some people would say, well, what, if someone's suffering and, what would be the problem with that? Well, there are many. To start with, it's discriminatory. So we've singled out one particular group of people based on our assumptions about what life with a disability is like, and that nobody should have to live like that, quote unquote. And so it's a discriminatory criteria. If I'm suffering intolerably, or someone else without a disability is suffering intolerably, or is experiencing suffering that's intolerable to them, we will do everything we can to prevent them from suicide or from, we will do what we can to make their lives better. But for people with disabilities under Track 2 MAiD, who are very often experiencing intolerable suffering, not because of their disability, but because they are living in poverty. They are lacking the disability supports they need. They are socially isolated. They're living in unsafe housing. They are eating from a food bank. The list goes on and on and on. They're being excluded from opportunities in their communities. They're institutionalized. The list is long and vast. And so the intolerable suffering is actually not caused by disability. It's caused, again, as I mentioned earlier, by all these external factors. And rather than say, well, we are going to treat you the same way we treat everybody else who's experiencing intolerable suffering, and we're going to do everything we can to make it better and to get you what you need. Instead, we say to people with disabilities, oh, over here for you, you have the special pathway to death, because we can't offer you a life on par with other people, but we can offer you support to end your life. And that is a horrible, terrible, awful thing to be doing.
Yeah, very problematic and very antithetical, if that's the word, to, as you said, how we would normally deal with or perceive somebody who wants to end their life. Instead of fixing the underlying causes, we're kind of just giving people an easy way out, which is really, I don't know what that says about us. But with Canada ending the life of a person with a disability every single day, what's the data? Like, who's making these decisions? Which demographics? Who is making the decisions?
Um, okay, well, first of all, we don't have a lot of oversight. Okay, so it's a decision. You get two doctors to sign off, and you can doctor shop. There's lots of people who get turned down by their doctor, and they'll, can meet with a doctor on Zoom for 10 minutes who's very pro MAiD and is willing to approve them, and find another doctor that will approve them. And so there's not a lot of, they talk about, oh, you must be made aware of services that are available. Now, you don't have to be offered services. You may not be eligible for said services. There may be a 10-year waiting list for said services, and your doctor may not even know of the services that are available. And nobody kind of monitors whether you even got asked if you had applied for services, but you certainly don't have to be offered services. And that's a big piece. We only just started collecting the data on who's accessing Track 2 and why they're accessing it. And what the data we have thus far tells us that it's disproportionately women, that it is over 50% of people who take MAiD under Track 2 say it's because of loneliness, because of being worrying about being a burden on their family, those types of things, reasons why they're accessing. We know that it is disproportionately affecting more marginalized populations, so Indigenous, racialized, the people that are at the intersection of disability and a bunch of other factors. And it's growing. So we are now losing more than a person a day, and that number is going up. And so the data is very, very troubling.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember reading, articles about people who had applied for MAiD on the basis of disability and poverty, let's say, and there would often be key phrases that would really jump out at me, like, do I actually want to die? Of course not. And it really makes you worry about what kind of society we're becoming and what we're supporting, I guess you could say.
Well, and we get calls at our office all the time from people, and not just people with intellectual disabilities. Like because we're on the forefront of this issue, we get people of all different types of disability, and the same thing all the time. I don't want to die. I don't want to die, but I can't. I mean, all these things are happening, and I don't know how I can continue to live like this. Or my doctor thinks I should. They're suggesting this or pushing this, and maybe I would just be better off. Maybe the world would be better off if I did this. So it's extremely challenging.
What sort of opposition have you seen, for example, at the convention in Geneva? What are the particular arguments that you have put forward? And I don't know. Where do you think we stand?
So I think the delegation came out really strong to the Committee on MAiD. We said it violates Article 10, which is the right to life of persons with disabilities, that it is discriminatory, and that it's essentially state-sanctioned eugenics. And the committee did come down quite hard on Canada. There were a lot of questions, very hard questions to Canada about Track 2 MAiD, about what the philosophy was behind it, like what exactly, explain to us what the philosophy behind Track 2 is. How do you see this as anything different than state-sanctioned eugenics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the responses are the same as they always are. We have safeguards in place. There's a 90-day waiting period. People can't be coerced. We have to, people have to be informed of services. So like that very week. And also we are giving people their autonomous right to decide. Well, it's so interesting to me that we're only giving this special right back to special things for special people. We're giving a special right to the autonomous right to decide to die in the face of intolerable suffering caused by a terrible system and lack of supports and inclusion for people. But we don't give that to anyone else. And we don't get an equal right to the support needed to live a good life. So there can be no autonomous choice in the face of impossible choices.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was curious about is, do you feel that people who state very clearly that these are their wishes and I absolutely consent to this, do you think that there are just too many factors that vitiate, uh, discount, eliminate that possibility to consent?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean,
Mm.
it, it's an impossible situation for people most of the time. And what's interesting is people will say, well, don't you feel like you're limiting uh, people's autonomy rights? And to be honest, I mean, we put limits on people's autonomy all the time. I can't drink and drive. I'm not allowed to carry a gun in particular places. I'm not allowed to do this. I'm not allowed to do that because of the harm that can be caused to other people, right? It's because of the greater harm. And so we limit people's autonomous decision making all over the place because of the greater harm that can be caused because of what my autonomous choice might lead to, right? So I mean, I think we have to really be thinking about that and be thinking about, people will say to me, well, do you think that if people with disabilities had all the supports they needed, then track 2 MAiD would be fine? No, it wouldn't be. I would love for tomorrow people with disabilities to have all the supports they could ever need or want. And I've been fighting for that my whole career, and I'll continue to do it till I'm done. But it doesn't take away the fact that we have singled out only one group of people as having lives not worth saving. And that, to me, is not something we can stand for.
Yeah, that's unreasonable if it's something that we explicitly don't permit for the general population. There's really no justification at all that isn't ultimately ableism. There's so much more we could talk about related to this, but I want to make sure we get into another issue that you advocated for strongly, which is denying people with disabilities their fundamental right to legal capacity through things like mental health laws, guardianship laws. How can Canada do better? What are the key issues, and how can we do better?
Well, I think the first thing is Canada has they reserved on Article 12. So they have a reservation on Article 12. So when they ratified the convention, they said, yeah, we agree with all this and whatever. But on Article 12, if that means that there can never be any form of guardianship ever under any circumstances, we don't agree with that. And I think what the big piece that most people don't understand is a couple of things. One is that when you put somebody under guardianship, you are literally taking away their personhood. So they are no longer considered a real person under the law, and they are no longer considered capable of making any decision about anything for themselves. Nothing. And that is a huge, like, people are taking out guardianship orders like it's, we're filling out a form here, and it's, it puts people at risk for all kinds of terrible things to happen to them against their will. The second thing is we seem to somehow think that decision making is only about, like, that everybody makes their own decisions completely independently. The test of capacity is I must understand and appreciate all the consequences of my decisions. Well, I can tell you I make 10 to 12 decisions a day minimum that I don't actually understand and appreciate all the possible consequences to, but I'm still allowed to make those decisions. And we also don't recognize that we make decisions in concert with other people. How many decisions do we make totally on our own? We talk to our friends, we talk to our family, we talk, we consult our colleagues, our coworkers. I mean, and so Canada needs to implement a very robust form of supported decision making where people can meet the test with support from people they trust, people they love and trust, who are not making their decisions for them, but are helping them to understand and appreciate, and still allowing them to make the decisions that they darn well should be able to make.
Absolutely. What would a Canada look like that encouraged more of the Inclusion Canada model, shall we say, where there was equitable access to support services, rather than some of the problematic ways the government is trying to fast track things?
I think we would look a lot more like a fully inclusive society that embraced difference and celebrated it and understood that whether disability or not, we are all different and we all make up an amazing fabric of this country, and we all need each other. We're better because of each other. And we would just, I think we would, it's the type of society that I would want my children and grandchildren to grow up in. And I think it's the society that we could hold up around the world and say, this is real. This is a real community that embraces the strengths and gifts, which everyone has, of all of our citizens. And we're a real inclusive country.
Krista, I really appreciate the advocacy work that you are doing on behalf of all of us, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come onto the Pulse today.
Happy to be here, always. Thank you for asking me.
Thanks so much to Krista Carr from Inclusion Canada for joining us today on The Pulse and for the important advocacy work they are doing. The Pulse airs on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern on AMI Audio. It's also available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Grant Hardy. Thanks so much for listening.